Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, John Harney. This episode focuses on the strategy game Ultimate General Gettysburg from Game Labs, which has attracted a reputation in gaming circles for, among other things, a responsive approach to controlling real-time strategy units utilizing particularly intuitive unit control. Of course, here at History Respawned we are particularly interested in the game's setting. The entire thing is focused on the Battle of Gettysburg, which you can fight as either a Union or Confederate commander. Our guest today is Michael Woods, Assistant Professor of History at Marshall University. Michael's work focuses on the history of the Civil War era and 19th century U.S. political history. He is the author of 2 books, the most recent of which, Bleeding Kansas, Slavery, Sectionalism and Civil War on the Missouri-Kansas Border, was published by Routledge Press in 2016. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here. Michael, I'd like to start with a fairly open-ended question, which is to ask you not so much about the Civil War itself, but to ask you to give us an overview of how we talk about the Civil War now in the early 21st century.
I think that's a good question. I think we end up talking past each other a lot when we talk about the Civil War. I think we can kind of engage it in 2 different ways. I think there are people who speak of it as a succession of battles, right, as an episode of U.S. military history. And then I think there are those who tend to speak of it as an episode in American political history, often with reference to the history of race and freedom in the United States. And I think those 2 can fit together. I think there are ways to connect them. But I think different people, when they speak about the war, they often have one of those 2 in mind. And so, one would take you in the direction of reenactment, maybe of wargaming as well. The other one would probably take you in a direction of other kinds of commemoration, whether that be in scholarship or in the public realm too. So I think sometimes we actually are talking about very different things when we talk about war.
I think that's a great point. Speaking as a foreigner, someone who has taken classes in American history but didn't grow up with these kind of various cultural understandings of what the Civil War was, for me, traditionally, the war itself has been focused completely on this concept of race. And, I mean, obviously that's a central component to the historical fact of the Civil War. But would it be fair to say that you're kind of arguing that the Civil War is something complex that can expand beyond that question of race in various directions?
Well, I think the conversation, for better or for worse, tends to. But I also think that, if you think about the way that we consume the Civil War, right, all the time in media and in, travel experiences, and those kinds of engagements with the war often do sort of shift us onto a really almost exclusively military track. I mean, if you visit battlefields, if you go to reenactments, if you play games, most Civil War films tend to focus on combat, although that might be changing. I think in recent years had a broader range of Hollywood engagement with the war. But I think as we consume the war, that often pushes the politics out of it, and what you get is a series of battles which it's never quite clear what's at stake in them, other than a sort of abstract victory or defeat, and there's sort of become an opportunity to show valor and not much else. And so I think it tends to, in some ways, the war makes less sense when you engage with it in that way. On the other hand, I know there is a tendency among some who teach the Civil War to sort of drain the military content out. And that doesn't really make sense to me either. I mean, it's a war, and a lot of it, it's decided on the battlefield, right?
This game is set entirely around the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, Game Labs are currently working on a broader campaign, Civil War game, which is in early access and will be available later in the year. But this game is focused specifically on the Battle of Gettysburg. And obviously, gameplay decisions have gone into that, aesthetic decisions have gone into that. But there's no question that choice is intriguing. This isn't the first game, by any means, to be specifically about Gettysburg. Sid Meier of Civilization fame had a game in 1997 called Gettysburg, which was very good. But by choosing Gettysburg, you are tapping into public discourses about the place of Gettysburg, the battle itself. It is iconic. It is in some ways has its own shorthand. What do you think about the game's very clearly delineated focus on this one specific moment in the history of the Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the one that's embedded in our consciousness. I mean, you don't have to explain it to people. I mean, you could every Civil War buff has their favorite battle probably, which is sort of an odd concept when you think about it, um, but it's certainly one that reaches beyond the history enthusiast. So the name gathers attention, and that goes way back. I mean, the mythology and the iconography of Gettysburg was there from the moment that the battle happened. I mean, I think the fact that it's in the Eastern theater of the war helps because those battles tend to be better known. They tend to be reported on by the press at the time instantaneously. It's a battle that a lot of people visited soon afterwards. And so, because the fighting moved away from there very, very quickly, so it became a tourist destination and really a kind of a pilgrimage destination very quickly. Um, and if you want to measure these things, I mean, there's more total casualties there than any other battle of the war if you combine all three of the days together. So it has a kind of grandeur that is, I mean, the reputation isn't undeserved for that. And then it also very quickly became tied to bigger narratives of the war that obviously rely on hindsight.
Michael, I'd like to ask you a question about iconography around the war, specifically around the Confederate flag. In 2015, Ultimate General Gettysburg was briefly taken down off the App Store, the iPad version of the game, is part of kind of a broader wave of Apple choosing to take action against games that featured the Confederate flag. And the game was off the App Store for about a day. The developers reached out to Apple and basically said, "Listen, it's meant to be an historic representation. We're not making a political statement." And the game was quickly reinstated. But I do find the whole kerfuffle interesting, and I'd love to hear what you think. Not at all on Apple's decision, but more specifically about how this reflects more recent conversations about that flag, and how we have constructed this discourse around this flag.
Right, right. I mean, I don't really want to weigh in on Apple's decision as a company. But I would say, I mean, two things strike me as important. I mean, the context there was actually a bunch of different companies that stopped selling Confederate flag merchandise at that time. This, of course, is after the Dylan Roof um, shootings in Charleston. Um, so Walmart was among those that pulled Confederate flag merchandise from their inventories. And so what interests me about that is this is something I've been following for quite some time. That struck me as a very different kind of debate than what we had seen before. I mean, up until that point, the discussion had been about the flag in official state-sponsored venues. Should it be flying on the state Capitol grounds in South Carolina? There's similar debates about the use of the Confederate battle flag as part of the state flags in Mississippi and Georgia. And so that was one debate about flying it. This one sort of took it from the sort of from the government realm into the market, into the marketplace, right? And you have private companies. I mean, I would assume making a business decision about this. It would be interesting to be a fly on the wall to listen to them think about this, but they're driven by a bottom line, and so um, it seems to me to have taken a very relatively old and relatively heated discussion in a very new direction. And I'm not sure that really um, struck a lot of people. I think they saw this as sort of more of the same, either for good or for ill, depending on what you think about it. But um, this it may change the way that we think about who's making the decision on the flag and how that decision is being made. Because this wasn't a political decision; it wasn't done by referendum. It was very much a market-based decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and if I might ask you too, so again, for me, I think of being young. I think of Axl Rose with the Confederate flag on the back of his jacket as he's performing live. I come from a place in Ireland called Cork, and Cork's colours are red and white, and so people would sometimes bring Confederate flags to games because those are the same colours. They would also have flags of the Empire of Japan, by the way, from the 1930s. And so I suppose that it's that connection between symbols and context is really fascinating, right? Presentation symbols. What if you forgive me for asking kind of almost a layup question? What's the 19th century context of that flag?
Right. So, I mean, I would begin by saying that the what people think of as the Confederate flag is probably more prevalent now and is used more now than it was during the war. Um, the symbol that they use in the game and that people tend to associate with the Confederacy is one that was used primarily as a battle flag by the Army of Northern Virginia. So this would be the Confederate Army that's engaged at Gettysburg, among other battles, of course. But it did become eventually enshrined in official Confederate symbolism. So the first national flag of the Confederacy did not include the symbol that we think of as the Confederate flag, but it went through a couple of revisions, and the second and the third flags of the Confederacy did. And so, for example, when the Battle of Gettysburg is actually fought in July of 1863, the Confederacy is on its second national flag, which had been adopted in May, and that one featured an all-white banner with the Confederate symbol as we know it in the upper left corner. So it's kind of an official and kind of an unofficial symbol. I mean, it's in a kind of a gray area there as the flags are changing. And so, is it technically correct to distinguish it from Confederate national flags? It is. Um, but I think, I mean, like you said, symbols have meanings in their context, and I think for good or for bad, that symbol has in modern thinking become a symbol of the Confederacy. And I think you can see that in this game. I mean, they use it as a counterpart, sort of on a parallel with the U.S. flag, right, in marking the units on the battlefield. So it clearly is being used to mean, Confederate, at least in identifying the units, which would be very much actually what a battle flag would be for, as well. But I have a colleague who has pointed out that um, that flag has been adopted by reenactors and at other living history kinds of events, probably a lot more than it would have been actually used during the war. And it's sort of close connection with one particular Confederate army has really been lost. And so I think even for those who are using it as a battle flag, it has also become the visible symbol of the Confederacy of any army or any unit that might be being depicted. So I think its meanings have changed and they've multiplied for sure. I mean, you can see it being flown when they start to tear down the Berlin Wall. Someone had hauled it out there. So it's sort of multiplied in its uses. There's a company in South Carolina that makes products that have that symbol, but the colors have been changed so that it has a kind of a Pan-African movement color scheme. And so they're kind of trying to reclaim this symbol for a very different political meaning than it had. So I think it's so well known that it's become very plastic in the meanings that people attribute to it.
Michael, I want to return to this idea of consumption, of consuming the Civil War. And, the American Civil War has been the focus of so much writing. And that writing straddles the divides between the academic world and public history and public discourse. And you also have, of course, the famous Ken Burns documentary in more recent years. I, as you would guess from the series, am very interested in how a video game taps into this. And Ultimate General Gettysburg is particularly fascinating, in my opinion, in the sense that its presentation almost implicitly makes an argument that it has no argument itself, that you come in and you are this supreme abstract godlike figure moving Buford and other, Robert E. Lee and all these generals around on a board. You are divorced from these various contexts beyond the reality of the military conflict, and that puts Ultimate General Gettysburg in a different position from a more, let's say, obviously scripted game like a Grand Theft Auto type game or something like that, or a game with specific characters and set pieces and dialogue. What do you think of this approach, and what do you think about this particular, I suppose, example of how we are consuming the history of the Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, they sort of, they're in ways, the game markets itself almost as a living history, right? You are in the commander's, chair, or, you're kind of there, you are responsible for the outcome. In looking through some of the footage from the game, though, I think it actually does connect with some of the bigger stories that we tell in some interesting ways. If you go to where you decide whether to play as the Union or the Confederate commander, they pull up a kind of description of the unique strengths and weaknesses of both sides. And so we get what is a very common kind of narrative of a kind of well-equipped, well-drilled Union army, but with poor leadership, against a very courageous but outnumbered but well-led Confederate army. And I think military historians would probably poke some holes in those kinds of generalizations. But certainly, they've actually built that narrative into the gameplay in an interesting way. And it's not meant to be a work of scholarship, but it clearly is drawing, I think, on existing assumptions or existing interpretations that people have had. And so, that screen just stood out to me as one where it is meant there to heighten realism, but how realistic are those those descriptions? That would depend on what historian you ask, or which battle you're talking.
Right, and the selection of facts is, of course, still really important, right? This idea that this is accurate and this is the way it is isn't the end all and be all either. It's the choice of facts, presentation, and so on.
Yeah, and I think they always have to have gameplay in mind, right? I mean, there's always a tension between quality of gameplay versus historical realism. I mean, if you wanted to really bring it to life, you'd have much less control over your units once you sent an order. You'd wonder if they received the order. You'd wonder if the commander would understand the order. You'd wonder if they would choose to follow it or not, right? So it gives, I think a real Civil War commander would love to have had the degree of control over his subordinates that you get here. So I'm not sure that one would really actually enjoy playing a game that was incredibly realistic, right? And so there is that balance of how do you make a playable game that still has some kind of historical authenticity to it, right? And that's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, like they'll designers will have a concept like morale. The morale of your unit matters and so on, but also there's not much fun in the idea of mutiny being like a completely random
Right,
thing or what have you.
right. I did like how they worked in morale with the presence of commanders, though, that they would have an effect on the morale of their soldiers, because Civil War officers are famous for leading from the front. They're right there. A lot of them saw that as their role, as sort of models of physical courage. And it's not a coincidence that there's no fewer than 9 generals who are killed during the Gettysburg campaign. So they're up there at the front, sharing in the danger, and that's I think they've actually woven that into the gameplay quite nicely, where the proximity of the commander has a very tangible effect. I think we know that was the case.
That's great. Well, listen, Michael, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
And thank you all for watching. If you like this content, please consider giving us a little thumbs up below and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. You can find us here on YouTube at youtube.com/historyrespawned. We also have a website, historyrespawned.com, which includes links to the videos and also to our podcast, which is readily available. The podcasts, which also feature discussions between myself and Bob Whitaker, usually feature a longer, more likely edited version of the conversations we have with our guests. If you're interested in supporting our work, this is a non-profit exercise which is very much focused on education. You can find us at patreon.com/historyrespawned. There's a link right up there above us in YouTube as well. You could make a small monthly contribution of any amount that you like. Look out for us also on Twitter at historyrespawn. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time.